There we go. Cool. Hopefully we can all hear me. Welcome to my talk. This is GitHub Actions for PHP developers, and I'm going to be talking for about half an hour, I reckon. So before we go any further, here's a little bit about me. I am a Laravel and JavaScript developer, professional now for around 3 years, but I've been developing since I was a kid. I'm from Essex, so the southeast part of England. I've worked on many open source things, but more notably Spruce, which is a global state management library for the Alpine.js framework, as well as the tool preset for Laravel applications. And I've been using GitHub Actions since the beta, so quite a while now. So I've got quite a bit of experience moving from other platforms, and I write blog posts here. You can go to that URL, read some things, you might find something useful. And I tweet about stuff there. So give me a follow. I'll be updating stuff about my course as well there. So what is GitHub Actions? Well, it's a first class or first party CI/CD platform on GitHub itself. So everything's in one place. You have your repositories there, and you can also have your CI/CD there. It's free for public repos. So if you've got an open source package or even an open source application, you can use it for free with unlimited build minutes, I think within reason, but unlimited technically. And even if you're not building a public package like a package or an application, you still get quite a generous quota. So I think now it's 2,000 minutes per month that you can use. And if you pay for GitHub, you get a bit more than that. So how does it work? Well, the process is actually rather simple. You go onto a tab on your repo and you enable actions. You create a new workflow. You set up triggers for your workflow, and you add actions to your workflow, hence the name GitHub Actions. But what actually makes up a workflow? Well, a workflow is made up of multiple jobs where each job has multiple steps. And each of those jobs can have one or more steps. And each step generally runs a command or a set of commands or even a pre-configured action. So what I'll be showing you today is how to set up PHP and any extensions that you need, how to install composal dependencies, how to run your PHP unit tests, as well as set up SAM, which is static analysis. So let me exit out here. And hopefully you can see my VS Code here. So I'm going to be using a Laravel application for this. I'm a Laravel developer, but the concepts can be applied to whatever framework or tool you're using. And I've got this set up on GitHub already. So if I go to settings, and if you go to the actions on the left-hand side, you can see that I've got actions enabled. If you've disabled this at some point, you might need to re-enable it. So let's get started. I mentioned that everything starts with a workflow. And in an application, GitHub will look for a .github folder. And now this is like a hidden folder generally that GitHub will use to store GitHub specific stuff. Inside of there, it will look for a workflows folder, quite aptly named. Each workflow is defined inside of a YAML file. So we're going to start with PHP unit tests. So I'm going to create a file called phpunit.yml. And this is where we're going to write our workflow. So if I just bring up some stuff to the side here. Let's start with a very basic workflow layout or distribution. We're going to start by naming our workflow. So we've already named the file, so it makes sense to call it something similar. If you've not seen YAML before, it's sort of like JSON, but without the curly braces and the required double quotes. So I'm going to call my workflow PHP unit. This makes sense. And each workflow has a set of triggers. And a trigger is essentially just an event that GitHub fires, and it will tell GitHub to run this workflow. So there's a whole list of triggers that you can use, but the most common ones that you'll see are probably push and pull request. We're going to be focusing on push. If you wanted to have multiple here, you just wrap it in an array-like syntax and just put pull request here. You might have seen I had some autocomplete there. If you just search for GitHub Actions. There's plenty and plenty of different extensions that you can install. Cool. So we're essentially saying we've got a workflow called phpunit. We want to run it on push and pull request. I won't be making any pull requests, so let's just call push. You can see I've got some IntelliSense here as well. It's telling me that I'm missing the property jobs. So we'll naturally move on to that step by adding a jobs key. And like I said before, each job has a set of steps. So let's create our first job. I'm going to call this phpunit. Again, what I'm doing in the action, in the workflow, sorry, is running phpunit. And we're going to go down here and create the job itself. We'll start by giving it a name. Everything has names, and this is how GitHub Actions displays it on the front end. So let's just call this phpunit for now, or perhaps run phpunit tests. Every job runs on a platform, and the most basic ones tend to run on a particular OS. So you do this by defining a runs on key. And you're developing a PHP application. So chances are you're deploying to an Ubuntu server or some sort of Linux or Unix-based server. So we'll use Ubuntu latest. For people who are developing packages, you might also want to use Windows. Or if you're really, living life on the edge, you can test on macOS as well by using the macOS runs on systems. Use Ubuntu. So the next step now is defining all of our steps. So quite logically, we're going to define a steps key here and go on to the next line. Each step is going to have a few different properties that you can define. The most basic one is a uses. And I said before that steps will run a set of commands or a predefined action. And the very first thing you're probably going to want to do is check out your repository. Luckily, GitHub has created a few under this actions namespace. So I'm saying I want to use the actions namespace, the checkout action, and then the version of the action. And this is basically, the boilerplate, if you like, for a GitHub action. We're defining a name, the triggers, and the very basic job, which has an operating system, and it checks out the repository for us. Another key that you might find yourself using is name. This is good if you want to describe what's happening. So I could have quite easily had a name key here. If I could type, and I could call this checkout code. It explains itself. The action, says what it does. So we'll leave that out for now. Now that we've got the code checked out, we probably want to set up PHP itself. So let's name this step setup PHP, and let's use another action. Now, GitHub doesn't have one for PHP. It has some for Node and Python, I believe. So in this case, we're going to be using a community action. So people can develop their own actions, publish them to the marketplace for everyone else to use. So we're going to be using this action here. I'm probably going to say this wrong, but shivamatur, and set up PHP, and then the version. Let me just disable spell checking here as well. Okay, so now we're setting up PHP, but the problem is this action doesn't know what PHP version to use. So let me show you how you can pass that into the action. There's another key that we can define here called with, and this is going to take more keys and values. In our case, we want to define the PHP version, so let's pass it through the PHP version. By default, this action will pull the latest stable release, so 8 now as of today, but yesterday it would have been 7.4. I'm going to be running 7.4 since I haven't actually tested anything on PHP 8 yet, but I know 7.4 works. So if we look back here, we're saying we want to set up PHP using this action, and this action expects some sort of argument. So we're saying with this PHP version. Another one that we can pass through is extensions. And Laravel in this case has a set of extensions that are required. And some of these do come out of the box with PHP, but I like to be explicit. So I'm just going to copy and paste these over here. So we've got C-type, BCMath, the JSON extension, PDO. And like I said, some of these do come out of the box with a standard PHP installation, but just to be explicit and safe, we can guarantee that they're installed now. One that I like to do here is actually just say no coverage. It can make things a bit faster, but you can also leave coverage on and it'll generate some things in the terminal for you. Cool, so now we've got PHP set up. Again, this is very basic stuff so far. This will get you running basically any PHP application or package. And also most PHP applications and packages use Composer these days. So let's go ahead and get Composer set up. So I'm going to call this install Composer dependencies. And it's good to be explicit here with the names, because if anything goes wrong in the process, you'll know exactly what step and what went wrong when. So before we've used actions, we've used community actions and GitHub provided actions. In this case, we just want to run a command. We're going to run composer install. And because we're running it, we can use the run key. And you can just put the command that you'd run here, the terminal command. So in this case, it's composer install. And we're going to say N for no interaction and prefer dist. So this will make sure we're not pulling through any dev packages if possible. And no interaction will prevent the yes or no questions coming up, and it will just automatically take the default argument. If you had something else that you wanted to run here before installing Composer, perhaps you want to check a file or something else, you can actually write multi-line strings instead of doing it all on one line. And you can just do this by putting a pipe symbol here and entering in on the next line. The pipe symbol is just a way of declaring a multi-line string. So let me just go back to what we had before, which was composer install -n prefer dist. Okay, so now we're installing composer dependencies. I mean, the last step here is just to add another step called name, and we'll call this run tests. And we run a command. So generally, you're going to be looking at the vendor folder and invoking that phpunit binary. And this is the most basic test. So if I commit this here, a good old whip commit, and if you want to know what this is doing, it's simply just a shortcut for adding all files, committing and pushing. If I head back over to GitHub now and head over to the Actions tab, you can see that GitHub has found this action, and I'm listening for the push trigger. So it's now running the action after I've pushed. And we can click into this. We can see the job itself running over here. We're installing composer dependencies, and there seems to have been a problem with the tests, which we can take a look at in a second. We'll just let the action finish up here. Give it 2 seconds. GitHub has decided to die. Oh, there we go. Cool. So if we click into the run test step here, GitHub has decided to break. Let's just give the page a refresh and see what comes out. Here we go. So there's a few problems. I'm running a Laravel application, so there are a couple more steps that we need to do. So like I said before, you can write multi-line strings. So let's do this. So I want to run composer install, and Laravel expects an env file. So let's just copy the example one to env.ci, and let's also run php artisan key generate. Now, if I commit this again, we can go back over to GitHub, and if we give it a second, let's refresh the page, you can see it's picked up this event. So that's a good example of debugging here. I knew exactly what the name of the task was, or the step in the job, so I could easily debug and see the output. So we'll let this run again.
So, quick question from Ruth while we're waiting for that to run.
Yeah, go.
Is the action version just a naming convention, or is it built in?
You mean the part after the @ symbol?
I assume so.
This part here. Well, when the action itself gets tagged and released on the marketplace, you'll just have to use the version string that is used there. I think in some cases you could have, sort of beta or alpha or something similar to that. It's all down to the developer, I imagine. But you'll find that most people follow the same convention as GitHub themselves. So they'll use a V2 or a V1. Hopefully that answers your question.
I'll keep an eye out for any further comments.
Yeah, sure.
But I think there's a best practice around actually specifying the commit hash as well. So you'll be able to validate the version that you're using. So rather than someone then can't just push up another V2 with any malicious code in it without you knowing. I think I saw that. I don't know if you've come across that.
I think they keep.
Sorry,
I think they keep updating V2 with multiple commits. So, for example, they released V2 a few months ago, and they keep updating this with some patches. There is V1 also, but there is probably compatibility breaking changes between V2 and V1. So I think this is their convention that they follow.
Okay, Rick said, I was wondering if you could choose to not version it. So is there could you do at latest or something maybe just to get the latest one? Or does it depend on how the repo is set up?
I mean, I've never actually tried it. I always like to lock in my dependencies like anything, just for the safety reasons. It's very possible that you could do that though. So GitHub seems to be having a few problems with its UI. Let's see here. What is the problem? Oh, this is my fault. This is what you get for live coding. Let's just rename that to .env. So with any luck, we should be able to run our tests here. Again, I'm live coding. So we'll let this run. Something that you might have noticed though, whilst these are running, actually, each time Composer's having to reinstall the dependencies, it's trying to, resolve the versions, build up a lock file, so on and so forth. If you've got a lock file in your project, then it'll be a bit faster. So what we can actually do is cache these dependencies. So I'll do this whilst this is running in the background. Just before we install the dependencies here, I'm just going to add another step, and I'm going to call this cache Composer dependencies. This is something you're going to do with any package manager. So GitHub decided to build one themselves, and we can say uses actions at cache. And we'll, actions /cache at v2. And this one also expects some arguments. So if you were using npm, you could change these accordingly, but for now, let's say the path or the folder that we want to cache. In this case, it will be the vendor folder, which is where Composer stores all of the dependencies. And we can also give it a key. And it will use this key to determine whether the cache needs to be busted or not and reinstalled fresh. So a good way of doing it is just by hashing the lock file, because the lock file will change anytime you install dependencies. And I'll introduce a new syntax here, which is sort of string interpolation inside of GitHub Actions. Use a $sign and then 2 handlebars, similar to a blade or a twig variable, I believe. And GitHub Actions provides a function called hash files, and we can just hash our lock file. So what this will do is the first time the cache runs, it will let it install normally. And then at the very end, it will build a cache. And the next time you run it, it will just use that cache unless the lock file has changed, the hash has changed. So I'm just going to commit this up again here. And if I go back to GitHub, you can see now our tests have run successfully. And if we take a look in, we get the output. We should get the output if GitHub was working. So we've installed all of our dependencies and we didn't have to say yes or no to anything. And if I scroll down here, you can see I've got 2 tests and they've both run successfully. If the tests failed, it would also show up here as a fail. So that's cool. Okay, the only thing I haven't covered so far with this sort of basic PHPUnit test file is database stuff. So some people do test with an SQLite database, which I won't be covering because it's just a case of creating a file and running your tests normally. Instead, I'll show you how to set up a MySQL server. And this is good for a couple of reasons, but if you're using MySQL in production, your test environment is going to be very close to your production environment. So that way you can kind of be sure and, it's safe to run this code in production if the tests pass, unless you find bugs. But okay, so sorry, my laptop's been a bit slow now. Let's just pull this back up. Okay. So yeah, let's set up MySQL or MySQL. So we're going to go somewhere near the top of the file just before steps, and we're going to add a new services key. And this is where we can define Docker containers in this case, or any third-party services, but normally Docker containers that you're pulling from Docker Hub or elsewhere. So I'm going to run a service called MySQL. And now there's a few things we can define. The first thing is an image. And this is the Docker image that you want to run. So for MySQL, I'm going to be using MySQL 5.7. You could use 8 here if you want, or 5.5. And the next thing we want are some environment variables. So we'll use the env key. And now we can pass these through similar to you would on the command line, so all caps. And there's a few that we want here for easy testing. So MySQL allow empty password. We want to say yes to this. And this will mean that the root user has no password. So we don't need to mess around with config there. And we also need to define a database for the service to create. So I'm going to create a database here, and let's just call it PHP South Wales. So this is instructing it to not use a password for the root user and to create a database by default. And we also need to define some ports, and these are the ports that the service is going to expose. And the standard for MySQL is 3306. Cool, so now we've got MySQL set up. This will instantly boot up a MySQL server when it starts running the action. And it also means that we have access to it down here in our steps. So the step in question is actually going to be phpunit. Before I do that though, Laravel requires a few extra steps that will mean I don't have to pass everything through inside of the workflow. So I'm going to open up the phpunit.xml file and let's add some server variables. So let's take all of these and let's just paste these in here. Do a bit of formatting. So I'm actually going to use the same server like this. So all we're saying here is the database connection is MySQL, the username is root, the database is PHP South Wales, which is what I've specified in the workflow just up here, the default database. And I've also added the host, which is localhost, and the port, which is 3306. See, the DB port in this case is going to be used locally, but in our workflow, we need to pass in the port from outside, just so if we change it in one place, we haven't got to manually change it in another. So we can also specify environment variables on actions or on steps, and we're going to be using the DB port like we did inside of the XML file, and we'll use this interpolation syntax that we saw earlier. So GitHub Actions provides a few objects that we can use here. So we're going to be using the job object, which will refer to this job that we're currently inside of, and the services key, and the name of the service. So we defined a service called MySQL up here. So we'll use MySQL down here, and we need to access the ports and a key of 3306. So this will just ensure that the action, the phpunit step has the right DB port set in the environment variable. Okay, so now let's whip commit this again. And I'll just clear the terminal. We'll go back to GitHub. And this time we should see some cache come into play as well. So let's just go into here. Let's take a sip of my drink whilst this runs. Is there any more questions?
I've been just digging and I found that you can pass tags, commit chars, or the branch name, so @main or @master, So it doesn't seem to be canonical at latest, unless there's a branch called latest or a tag called latest. I'd recommend using the chars just for security and reliability. Nothing's going to change between v2. But, yeah, that's what I'd suggest anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of stuck with the strict versions, the v2 or a tag. So, but yeah, you're right. There might be cases where people push vulnerable code or malicious code up to a tag.
Yeah,
and you'd end up putting it in without meaning to.
Yeah, I guess tags can change, whereas commits are mutable. Ruth's other comment was this seems quite like Ansible. Those at the beginning, which you made that first comment. Let's see here. Yes, one difference from Ansible is the interpolation syntax. Yeah, the way you do the interpolation is a bit different. If you do it with Ansible, it would be the double curly brace type syntax again.
Yeah. So the Ansible doesn't need the dollar, but does need the whole thing to be quoted.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So you can wrap these in quotes if you wanted to, if you had some sort of string, but it doesn't really make much of a difference because it's being interpolated anyway. So the output will be a string. And also YAML isn't really that fussed about it. So, I mean, the workflow finished running.
Just very quickly going back to the version thing. So would we assume then that v2 in your actions that you've been using is going to be one of a branch name or a tag? I mean, it doesn't matter which. I'm just saying, is that what we're saying?
So here we go. If we see, we've got the v2. This is the checkout action, the one that I ran at the very beginning.
Right.
So v2. So running v2, I'd automatically get all of these sort of patches.
Yeah.
And minor releases as well.
I saw there a tag called v2. So when you say v2, you're not going to get 2, 3, 4 because that's. Oh, maybe.
Yeah. So everything will be merged back into this v2.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, it's a tag.
So
that's fine.
I think that was my point. Yeah, v2 could change between runs, which is intentionally or otherwise. So what you might get, what you pull down for v2 might be different based on whether they've retagged it, for example, like they would have done in this case, I guess. Mike said he's seen a few people making forks to avoid bad actors. So
it can be done.
Pushing the same thing. That's another good approach as well.
Yeah. I mean, something like that you can get with anything. Composer packages are the same, npm packages are the same. But yeah, it's definitely up to your security policy. I myself, almost I'm the one responsible for this in this case. So if anything does go wrong, I'll blame myself for not being more secure. Yeah. Cool. So I mean, our action finished, and you can see the cache stuff that we did earlier has kicked in here. So if I go into cache composer dependencies, GitHub is really playing up today. Cache composer dependencies, you can see it's received the cache, it's pulled it out, and it's restored it using this key.
Oh, I
so
see.
this is just going to be a hash.
Made a tar file from it.
Yeah, exactly. So if we go into install, nothing's been installed because it's already there.
Yeah.
And later on down here, you can see the post cache. So if anything was changed, it will recache it and store that tar. And running our tests, nothing indicates that we're using the database, but nothing failed. So everything hopefully was okay, including the containers. You can see we started up a MySQL service container and we stopped it down here. So there's some cleanup. So I mean, that's MySQL, that's PHP Unit. One more example I will show you, just to show you how quickly it is to get things running once you've got one going. Let's create a new workflow file for SARM. And the best way to go about this is just to copy and paste. Remove the bits that you don't need. We don't need any of this. And we definitely don't need a database anymore. And we can just rename stuff. So let's call this one Psalm. Let's just rename all of these keys here. Run Psalm. You could also do the same with PHP Stan if you use PHP Stan. I personally use Psalm. So we still want to cache composer dependencies. We still want to install composer dependencies. Let's create a new key here called run Psalm. And we're going to add a run key like we did for composer. And similar to phpunit, we're just going to be using the binary here. And I guess the only step left is to install Psalm. So it's Vimeo Psalm as a dev dependency. So let's just give this 2 seconds to run. Hopefully, I'm still not on Composer 2 yet, so hopefully it doesn't die on me. We should be all good. Is there any other questions in the meantime?
No, nothing. I have been caught up by the Composer 2 thing. Some projects using a plugin that wasn't Composer 2 compatible. And yeah, you can specify tools as a key and then Composer :1 if you did need Composer 1.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that's hit me with Composer V1 is the memory limit. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not. So I'm just going to run Psalm locally here just to verify that everything's working. And of course it's not, because we haven't got the XML file. Again, live coding. This is what you get. Let me just copy and paste this over as well. So Psalm requires a psalm.xml file. Just going to paste this in here. I'm using a Laravel app again, so we're going to be looking inside of the app folder, which is where all of our application code goes, and the factories and seeders folders as well, since these are class-based now in Laravel 8. And we're going to ignore the vendor folder. It's not your responsibility to statically analyze any dependencies. So if I open the terminal and give this another run, you can see it scans some files. We'll give it a second. It's analyzing stuff. And there was one error found. So I imagine this is because it's possibly null, down to the optional returning a null. I'm sure some people out there will shout about that because global functions. So let's just whip commit this up here. Again, this is very simple stuff. You define what you want to run, the steps. Once you've got it running in one place, you can take the carcass, if you like, of a workflow and apply it to anywhere else. All of this stuff here can basically be used for any PHP application. You set up PHP, you install some composer dependencies, and away you go. So if we now... I'm not sure I understand. There's Siri going off at me. So you can see now we've got 2 workflows running because they're both listening for that push trigger. So we've got the Psalm and the PHP unit. Let's just click into Psalm here. And you can see it's also failed like it did locally. And you still get the same output. I think that's what's important here. You don't lose any of that output. You still get exactly what you would get in the terminal, which really helps with failed workflows. That's pretty much it from me. I'll just... Oliver did mention it earlier. I am working on a GitHub Actions course. It's a lot cleaner and tidier than this because GitHub was working whilst it was being recorded. But if you want, you can go to actions-for-php.com and click this Get Notified button here, and you'll get signed up to the newsletter. If you sign up before midnight on Monday, or 11:59 on Monday, midnight Tuesday, you'll receive a 25% discount when it releases, sort of like my Black Friday before release deal. So yeah, if you do sign up, you'll get a little discount when it does launch if you're interested in buying. As far as details go, the release date is before Christmas. I haven't kind of solidified that yet. I want to sort some stuff out on my end. But it will go much, much further than this. I'll be covering custom actions and how you can write those using Docker containers so that you can use some PHP to write those custom actions, automatic deployments, notifications via Slack or Telegram or Discord, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So yeah, if you're interested, please sign up to the newsletter, and I'll be sending updates out quite regularly until it releases. But yeah, thanks for letting me very slowly and very poorly showing you some GitHub Actions stuff, but hopefully it was enough to give you a good idea of the basics of GitHub Actions and how you can use it. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, virtual round of applause, everybody.
Thank you.
There's no further questions in the meetup channel right now. I don't know if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. And that, yeah, feel free.
Right, Ryan, I just want to say I actually thought that was really good. So not poor at all. So well done.
Thank you. It went a lot better the other week. GitHub wasn't playing up like that. Yeah, live coding. My second time doing it. So
I'm curious. So I can see when you've added the second workflow in, you've added the SARM workflow. Is there a best practice around creating the separate workflows rather than just adding? The other way I've seen it done is just to have one big CI workflow with multiple jobs in it. I guess in this instance, one needs the MySQL database and the other one doesn't. So there's quite a clear difference. So I can see sort of advantages for both ways here. I think the only reason I've tripped up with this is if I then want to do something like do a deployment, if everything else passes and everything's in a separate workflow, then it gets quite tricky to say only don't. If it's in one workflow, it's really easy to say this relies on the others. But if they're in separate workflows, I think that's become a bit trickier. So I've not found a best practice that I'm aware of. If you come across anything like, what's your recommendation once you be putting this course together? I guess really.
You know what? I think it's like anything else, really. There might be a best practice. There's nothing that GitHub recommends. They don't say do everything in a separate workflow. I think personally, I've found that some things like SARM, for example, I might want to run on different occasions. So my tests, I might run SARM on every push to the repository, but not on pull requests, or vice versa. So those triggers make the difference, as well as services. But also those services are specific to a job itself. So although SARM didn't need the MySQL database, it could have quite easily been another job in the same workflow and still wouldn't have had that MySQL service. So yeah, it's personal preference at the end of the day. Like you said, there might be some instances where you want to deploy, and GitHub does allow you to do conditionals. So you can say if this workflow has run or has passed or something similar to that. That is possible. I do cover that in the course. But yeah, personal preference. If you like having one big file, you can have one big file. If you like having smaller separate files, you can do that as well. So
cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Michael, you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
I think one of the things that I spotted is if you're running separate tests, you can hook into whether that test pass or fail. So where you have on your README document at the top of your README document, and you can have like an icon showing whether it's red and it's failed or green and it's passed. If that actually can hook into the test, and it can automatically update if your tests are passed or if your static analysis has failed or whatever. So that's one of the things that I spotted, and that was one of the benefits. I just posted on the chats now one of the experiments I did. It was about 8 months ago now. I'm just surprised how long ago it was. Time's absolutely flying. But yeah, I did some tests with static analysis and and tests and code quality. I did one for easy coding standard, and each one of those has got its own like icon on the top of the README, and they're in with a fail banner. So those just run
That's just me. I think not. Might have lost Michael, but it's just me. I don't know.
I think Michael's stopped.
Okay.
Yeah. Michael froze a little bit there. I got the gist of it though. Yeah, you're right. You can, if you run workflows separately, you can check the status of each workflow. Like you said, the little badges at the top.
Yeah. So if you look at the chat window, I put a link to those tests that I was running on Actions about 8 months ago. Yeah. So if you look at that particular repo, it's only like a little API to have some sort of text to speech thing, and that one has the badges at the top. So a couple of them I think were just static, saying it's static analysis to level 8 or something like that. But some of them were actually hooked into whether the tests or the workflows passed, and if they failed, they would turn red. On a question about your coverage, notice you put coverage as a line. Did you need to have X debuggers to test that separate?
Sorry, you lagged a little bit there as well.
So then you need to cover pull in X debug as well.
I think the question there was if where I disabled the coverage, if I wanted coverage, would I have to pull in Xdebug?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, I think
yeah.
So that coverage key, you can specify Xdebug or PCOV as well. And the action itself will just take care of putting everything in for you. I wouldn't have had to specify Xdebug as one of the extensions in that list. So you could say coverage Xdebug or coverage PCOV, and it'll pull it all in for you. I think the PCOV one can take any values as well. But yeah, a lot of it's handled for you by that action. As a matter of fact, that action can actually set up other things as well, like caching certain stuff, caching extensions. It can do that. It's quite well thought out as a community extension. But yeah, you wouldn't have to do much other than just say Xdebug or PCOV.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Just having another quick look in the Slack channel. No, can't see anymore. Well, yeah, thanks again for a really nice introduction to GitHub Actions. Hopefully that's
no worries.
been useful for everybody. I look forward to seeing a bit of a checking with everybody maybe in the new year, see what stuff they've been able to automate, as well as the sort of testing and static analysis. So.
Yeah, it's a powerful platform, outside of just the general CI/CD stuff. It's powerful. But yeah, I go into a lot of that in my course. Don't want to give everything away for free.
Yeah, another one I recommend, Michael Heap has been doing a building action that's more on building more custom actions as well. So it doesn't touch too much on the stuff that we've just talked about. But yeah, if you want to build your own actions, that's quite useful.
How did you find setting up the course for your action, by the way? I'm just super curious about that. So I'd love to try and do the same at some point.
The what, sorry?
The actual course, like distributing the content and stuff. How have you approached
that? So I'm using Vimeo or Vimeo, however people say it these days, for the videos. And then it's just a Laravel app. The payment is powered by Paddle, so I don't have to take care of digital VAT or anything. And then it's got a Laravel Nova backend that I can use to update and order content and whatnot. Yeah, I think I built it in about 4 hours, to be honest. Payment, everything. Didn't have to set up payment forms. Everything's like a integrated modal sort of thing that Paddle handles. Yeah, tests a lot. Might not be the prettiest code I've ever written, but it's functional. So
sounds like another talk to me,
nice.
building a sales platform on Laravel.
yeah, it could be.
You could sell that course on it, maybe.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could sell a course on building a course, courseception.
See how many layers deep you can get.
Yeah, infinite.
Courses all the way down.
Yeah.
I was actually looking at Squarespace recently because they've just released something really similar to that. But I think as a dev, if I was to use Squarespace, people would just shoot me very, very quickly.
Building your own platform is all part of the fun.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Somebody built as a previous company. I don't think it was Squarespace, but it was one of the similar tools, and they came out with this site that looked really fancy, but I think it had 4 GB homepage, which was just stupid. Had about 3 or 4 really big, massive images.
Yeah, as a PHP user group, we can't encourage people not to use Squarespace or Laravel or whatever. But yeah, use whatever you prefer. Any other questions? We can certainly carry on the conversation, but I can certainly stop the recording at this point if you've got no more questions about the actions topic specifically.
Ask me anything. Okay. Doesn't matter.
And people can get in touch with you on Twitter or some other way as well, right? If they think of something afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, you can probably put my Twitter handle somewhere on Slack.
Yeah, we'll post it in Slack, and if you send us the link to the slides in the repo, we'll tweet those out and post those in Slack as well.
Yeah.
Talking
of Slack, directly.
Michael Pritchard, as in, it would be sensible if you could add your website to the Slack channel. The one you put on the chat.
Yeah, will do.
Okay, I'll stop the recording now, and then yeah, we can carry on. But I'll just stop the recording at this point, just for the sake of the video later on.